Basics of how to use functions in Python, and also the general views like in what scenarios you need a function and how to design your function. For background, my name is Puneet and I'm one of the student in the course Introduction to Interactive Python Programming. So function is like a reusable block of code, so which you can execute again and again. So it's kind of helpful in avoiding the code duplication, and it's always used for a definite purpose. That purpose may be computing something and then returning the result, or it may be a simple thing like printing just some data, or it may be modifying some data and just leave rest as it is. So I think you have already seen some examples of inbuilt functions like print, which takes a string and print it on the console, and also the math.10 function. Okay, so let's try some basic syntax. So I'll start with a simple function. So to define a function, you need a keyword called def and then the function name. Defining a function with 0 parameters, and what it does is it simply prints a string. This is a simple function. Let's call this function. Okay, so to call, we write function name. Let's try to run it. So it's simply printing what it's supposed to do. And okay, one more thing we want to see, and that is what is the value that is getting returned by this function. So what we'll do here is we'll print the return value of this function. Let's try it. As you can see, it does print this string. This is a simple function, but here what we are doing is we are also trying to print the return value of this function, but it doesn't actually have a return statement. So in summary, what is happening is a function which doesn't have a return statement or which doesn't return something. A default value of none is returned by those functions. So yeah, let's try one more function, and this time we'll return something. Function sum, and this function has two parameters a and b, and what we'll do is we'll just simply return the sum of a and b. Okay. Let's try to execute it. Print function sum, and we supply two arguments 3 and 4, so we should get some value of 7. Let's try it. So we are getting the value of 7, and please note that this function is not doing anything, just returning the sum of a and b, and we are just printing whatever value we are getting in return. So yeah, this result makes a lot of sense. One more thing I like to point out, what is the difference between this parameters and arguments. So function parameters are like something which you define when you're defining a function. So in this function definition, a and b are the function parameters, but when it comes to the arguments, so you supply the arguments when you make the function call. So you supply same number of arguments as you have number of parameters in the function definition. So here you are supplying arguments 3 and 4 and corresponding to function parameters a and b. So just keep this in mind that when you're defining a function, you define function parameters, and when you are calling a function, you provide function arguments. Okay, let's look at some more examples of function, and also the question that why and when we need to return a value from a function. Taking some kind of a simple example like area of a circle. Okay, and the formula is pi into r into r. So what I want is I want to calculate this product r into r using a function, and I want to use that computed value to calculate the resulting area. So first thing I need is a function that can calculate this area, sorry, square. So let's call that radius square and parameter r, and what we are going to do here, Let's try a print statement, print r into r. Okay, so I guess our function is complete. Let's try to execute. Let's try 7. It does return 49, so it's not returning 49, but actually it's printing 49. So does it make sense? It makes sense since it is a single function, it's not getting used anywhere else. So let's try to use this function in calculating the area. Let's try to import math module first for pi. So I declare a variable area is equal to math.pi, and we have a function radius square, and that will, let's give it value 7. So print the value of area finally. Let's try to execute this. So here we are getting a error that unsupported operand type for multiple float and none type. So the problem is math.pi is actually a float type, but this function radius square is returning a none type. Why? Because we don't have any return statement here. So what we need to do is replace this print with a return statement, and let's try again. We are getting the area. So the conclusion is, when you are expecting a result from a function that is consumed at some another place, like algebraic expression, you should use a return statement inside the function. So that's the one of the most common usage of a function, to return something after computing something. In many cases, some functions just do some another kind of job, like displaying the data by print statements. So let's try one more example, and this time what we want is, we want a function to print square, and we also want to display a simple message afterwards, and that should happen inside a function. So let's try that. Let's try function square, and we give argument a. So okay, let's change something. We want a function that should return a square value of the supplied parameter. So we'll return a to a, and we also need to display a simple message like done. Okay, let's try to execute this function square. Okay, let's also try to print the value that is getting returned from the function square. Let's try 7. Okay, let's try to execute this. So we are getting the value of 49, so this thing is getting computed correctly. We are getting 7 into 7, that is equal to 49, but our print statement is not executing. We are not getting the done message. Why it is happening? So the answer is, whenever a return statement executes inside a function, the control immediately exits after that return statement. That means if there are any statements after the return statement, that won't be executed. So what happens is, this print done, it won't be executed at all. It will never be executed. How to correct this? So in order to execute something, you need to put it before the return statement, because after return statement everything will be gone. Let's try it again, and we are getting the done. So if you want to put any logic or any calculation before displaying the result or before returning, put it before the return statement, not after that. Okay, let's talk about variables and function scope. Variables and function scope. So whenever we create a function like this function which just increments a number and returns the incremented value, so I'll create a variable inside the function number is equal to n, and I'll increment that number by 1 and I'll just return the value. So this variable called number which is declared inside okay, coming to the function first. So whenever we declare a function, it creates kind of a scope or block in whichever variables which are declared inside this function, their scope is limited to this function only. What I mean by that is, if you try to access that variable outside this function scope, it will give you error. So I've seen this a lot of students trying to print the number like this, and it should give an error, and it does. So what's happening is this number is declared inside this function scope, and it's limited to that scope only. When we exit this function, it gets destroyed. So that's why this number is not accessible outside and we are getting the error. So let's comment this out, and I'll try to create one more function which will decrement the value instead of incrementing it. Let's try to dc, and I'll subtract 1. Let's try executing both these functions. Function incr by 7 and function bcr by 7. So one should return, the increment should return 8 while the decrement should return 6, and the result is correct. So please note that we are using the variable with the same name number inside both the function, but since that variable is limited within the respective scope of that function, the number inside declared inside this function is not visible to outside scope and not to scope of this function. So we can declare the variable with the same name inside the different functions without creating a kind of conflict. So still, if we try to print this, it will still give an error because we don't have access to inside scope. Now let's create a variable called number in outer scope, and when I try to uncomment this, it should return me a value because this is in outer scope and I get the value. So first I print a number, that is 1, and then I call this function increment function which takes the value 7 and increment to 8, and then I call the decrement function that will take the value 7 and decrement it to 6. Now my question is, what if I want to create a function that should modify the value of this variable? So there is also a way to do that. So let's try to create a function, we call that global. Let's try to just increment that. So what we do, we are not supplying any arguments because we want to access this variable directly. Now in order to access a variable that is outside the scope, or that is at the same scope at which the function was declared, you have to use this keyword called global number. By this way you will be able to access this variable inside this function. Now let's try to increment this by 3. Its original value was 1, so 1 plus 3, it should return us 4 in this case. And let's try to print global incr, and so first we are getting the value 1 for number, then the global increment, it's returning the 4. Yes, we are getting the value as expected, and then we are incrementing for 7, so it's 8 and then 6. It might create some confusion, but you might to take a look again. So in order to access a global variable that is declared outside the function, you need to use this keyword called global and the number. So if you try to execute a statement like number is equal to 1 or number is equal to 0, it will affect this variable only. So by executing this, you are not creating a variable inside the function, you are just modifying the value of this. So this will evaluate to 3 in this case. Let's try to execute, and yes, we are getting the value of 3. So I think this should be good enough.